Hello, anatomy friends. This is Dr. Alsip. And so we've discussed the basics of the skeletal system as well as joints. And now it's time to add in the last part of the musculoskeletal system, skeletal muscle. As you know, this is not a physiology class, so we're really going to focus in on the anatomy. We're going to talk a little histology, but for the most part, we're talking big picture stuff to best understand the different parts of the regional anatomy and some of the terms there. So we're going to start our discussion of the skeletal muscle with just overall properties, functions, and types of muscle. As I'm your first lecturer in the course, I get the privilege of getting to introduce some of the different parts or different types of different types of muscle. Obviously, we're going to talk about skeletal muscle quite a bit with the musculoskeletal portion, but there's also cardiac and smooth muscle, and I do want to at least introduce those. So kind of what I mentioned here, properties, functions, and then just some of the very big picture concepts regarding the different types of muscle. So let's start with properties of muscular tissue. So this just isn't just skeletal muscle. This is all types of muscular tissue. And I think the first one is usually the most exciting one. And this is electrical excitability. See, it says excite right in there. And this is really neat in the fact that this is the muscle cell's ability to respond to certain stimuli by producing electrical signals. And these are referred to as action potentials. And you will often see it in my slides and upcoming lecturer slides, abbreviated as AP. And so what happens here is that you're going to have these action potentials that will actually travel along the muscle cell's plasma membrane due to ion channels. So those ion channels open and close based on how it's traveling down from the nerve cell down to the muscle cell. And this is neat because this is a property of nerve cells as well. So this property is shared by both muscle cells as well as nerve cells. And it's a really unique thing. It almost seems a little bit like magic in a way. And there's really two major ways by which this can happen. There is going to be electrical means, which is particularly important in terms of cardiac or autorhythmic muscle. And we'll talk about that in more detail in an upcoming block. And then when we're talking about skeletal muscle, chemical means, which is most commonly neurotransmitters that are going to be released by neurons, that's going to kind of go through this cleft here, and then it's going to initiate action potentials on the muscle cell plasma membrane. So again, this is where we'll spend a bit more time, and you'll come back to this when you get into the cardiac type of muscle. So electrical excitability, super neat in terms of a property of muscular tissue. The other three properties of muscular tissue kind of go together. So we're going to talk about them together. And the first is generally the most intuitive, and this is contractility, or the ability to contract. And so muscle cells will contract when they're stimulated by those action potentials. And what happens here is that you're going to have the generation of tension, while sometimes pulling on attachment points on the bone. So you literally will have the muscle tendon, so that connective tissue there, that's going to interweave with portions of the skeletal tissue. And so when this contracts, this will allow for movement to occur. And so we'll talk about the different types of contraction. Generally, when we think of contraction, we're thinking of concentric contraction, so where the muscle is actually shortening, but there are other types of contraction. We'll talk about that. And there'll be certain types of contraction where you don't actually have visible movement occurring, but the muscle is contracting. These two really go together, extensibility and elasticity. And sometimes it's hard to conceptualize when you're actually thinking about actual muscle. So I like to use this more simplistic visual, which is a rubber band. So with extensibility, this is the ability to stretch without being damaged. You can pull on this rubber band pretty hard. And generally you can do it pretty far without it breaking or being damaged. Now, obviously you can extend it to an extent where it can cause damage. And we can talk about, how that happens with connective tissues and causing damage there. But generally, most most muscle cells will have the ability of being stretched without being damaged. Some muscle cells, like smooth muscle cells, can be extended to a greater extent than, say, skeletal muscle. Elasticity is very important. If you have extensibility, you need to be able to return to the original length and shape after contraction. And so you can kind of have this rubber band that can return to its general shape and it be okay. Sometimes if you stretch too far, you don't get quite to where you need to be with elasticity. But generally, there's the ability for it to return to its original length and shape. So extensibility and elasticity go together very well. So those are the properties of muscular tissue. Again, all types of muscular tissue. And then there's some general functions of muscular tissue that are really important. Many of them we've kind of already think about and know. So the first is producing body movements. We talked about that a little bit with contractility. So it is muscular tissue that's allowing for body movements to occur. It's also muscular tissue that plays a huge role in terms of stabilizing body position, particularly if you think of postural muscles, which are skeletal muscles for the most part. So I'm able to sit upright and not kind of collapse because I have some type of contraction happening in my postural muscles. So it can play a role in terms of stabilizing body position. Another one we kind of think about, but I don't know, we don't think about it a lot in terms of say skeletal muscle tissue, but it does play some role there, and that's storing and moving substances within the body. And again, when we think about this, we really think about this with the other types of muscle tissue, so cardiac and smooth muscle. So if you think about blood moving through the heart and through the blood vessels, smooth muscles, if you think about the viscera associated with the gastrointestinal system, that kind of comes up a lot of times. So you can have those playing a role there. But skeletal muscle can play a role in terms of moving substances within the body as well, particularly if you think about contraction, helping the blood associated with the veins go back to the heart. That will play a role, or the lymphatics as well. So we'll talk about some of these examples. But oftentimes when we think about this particular function, it's the cardiac and the smooth that have kind of the biggest thing that we think about there. And the last function is an important one, which is producing heat in a process called thermogenesis. So for those of us that live in Michigan in the winter, you've likely experienced this when you get really cold, you're going to shiver, right? And that's going to be involuntary contraction of skeletal muscles. Shivering will dramatically increase the rate of heat production. So that's going to play an important role as well. Okay, so those are the properties and functions of muscular tissue as a whole. And again, I mentioned that there are 3 types of muscular tissue. I kind of kept bringing them up. This first one, skeletal muscle cells, are the ones we're going to talk about the most in musculoskeletal. They're named skeletal muscle cells because they generally have an attachment to the skeletal system, so to bone. You often hear skeletal muscle cells as striated and voluntary. Okay, so striated and voluntary. And they are called striated. It's referring to this alternating dark and light bands that you can see histologically or under microscopy. And we'll talk about how that's actually produced when we talk a little bit about histology in a moment. Skeletal muscle cells differ from its colleagues, the cardiac and smooth muscle, by being referred to as voluntary, meaning that for the most part, most skeletal muscles, are consciously controlled. I can think I want to contract, and I do. Okay. Now, there are some, particularly in terms of reflexes, where it's not as consciously controlled, but for the most part, and to simplify, think skeletal muscle is going to be voluntary and striated. Now, when we talk about cardiac muscle cells, these are going to be unique to the heart. It's going to make up the majority of the heart walls. And they differ from skeletal muscle in the fact that these are going to be involuntary, but they do appear striated in microscopy. So you can see if you're looking under it, it looks like it has those alternating light and dark bands, a little bit different than what you have with skeletal muscle, but it is certainly different than the smooth muscle, which is going to be smooth, so no striations. The heart is super neat, and you're going to talk about this in a lot more detail in that particular block, but it has its own pacemaker that initiates each muscle or each contraction associated with the cardiac muscle. So it's referred to as autorhythmic, but there are going to be certain neurotransmitters and hormones that can adjust heart rate. So more to come here. But it is going to be different in the fact that it's going to be striated, and I should put a T because smooth is also an S. So it's going to be striated as well, but it's going to be involuntary. And then last but not least, we have the super cool smooth muscle cells, which are characterized as being non-striated or smooth, as its name would suggest. And it's going to be involuntary. These are going to be involuntary as well. Smooth muscle is all over the place. We particularly think about it with the viscera or the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity, but it's within the airways, it's within blood vessels. We talked about elasticity and extensibility. Smooth muscle cells tend to be more extensible than the colleagues, the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle cells as well. So more to come in other blocks on these two. This is going to be the star of the show in musculoskeletal, in addition to, of course, bone and joints. All right. So that was fun in terms of properties, functions, and the different types of muscle cells. Let's review a quick concept here before we move on. So which property of muscular tissue is shared with nerve cells? Remember, this one was exciting, hint, hint to me. Is it contractility, elasticity, electrical excitability, or extensibility? So pause the video. And when you're ready, hopefully you landed on C, being the only property of muscular tissue that's also shared with the nerve cells. These are going to be they're going to be excitable as well. You're going to have those action potentials associated with both of those. It could be chemical, it could be electrical as well. That's going to allow for these action potentials to kind of travel down. Contractility, elasticity, and extensibility are very important in terms of muscular tissue, but not so much in terms of nerve cells. And much more to come in terms of nerve cells in the next block as well. Okay, excellent. So this was a good start to our discussion in terms of skeletal muscle tissue. Let's talk a little bit more detail about the microscopics. Not too much. Again, we're not in a physiology course, but we do need to understand some of those concepts before we move into the regional anatomy. Thanks so much for your time and attention. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out.